Wow. Follow Elizabeth Gilbert. Who would have thought it, right? So this is not going to be a talk about Michelangelo. Sorry, Dana, I see you there. It's not going to be a talk about Leonardo da Vinci or Rembrandt or Van Gogh. And I imagine for many of you, these would be exactly the kinds of figures you think about when you think about the idea of artistic genius. And is there any doubt, really, that you would think that, since it really is art history and art historians like me that are part of really that process of constructing and perpetuating the idea of artistic genius from the very beginning? Ideas that we associate with, one, the notion of some kind of God-given talent, or two, the idea that maybe we associate with the notion that art must always be beautiful, or three, the idea that somehow art is timeless and transcendent and must always live beyond the moment, or four, the idea that the artists themselves is some kind of superhuman, extraordinary individual that is somehow above the norm. It's true that if you really break down the idea of artistic genius, it is really meant to intimidate, it's really meant to individuate, and it's certainly meant to exclude. And it's true that there are incredible obstacles, and it's no doubt that so many people, and no wonder that so many people give up on their dream of becoming an artist or trying to understand art, or worse yet, stifle their own artistic talents in the pursuit of such unrealistic goals. It's true, yes, it takes a great deal of confidence to be an artist, but much of that confidence is actually gained from the ability to really dispense with these standards, to embrace one's own creative potential, and in many ways let go of this fear of not measuring up. And that's really what is at the heart of it. So what if we were to unpack this idea of artistic genius? What if we were to dispense with the rhetoric, we were to unpack, we were to strip away and really emancipate the idea of artistic genius to something that I'd like to call the idea of an everyday genius? This is something that I believe can not only be taught and really learned, but more importantly, it's an idea that I believe can be harnessed, not only for the use of individuals, but also for the use of individuals working together in groups to make the world perhaps a better place. So, moving to my own area of study, and that's really in the 20th century, it's true that the history of modern art provides us with many really interesting turning points in the understanding of genius. It's true that these turning points are a part of really understanding what makes this one of the most beguiling and interesting areas of study that many people are naturally drawn to. The 20th century provides us with moments in history and art making where we can see radical shift away from the expected. We see the move towards abstraction, we see the move towards expressionism, and when the move towards a kind of subjective experience of art. And we see really a move away from traditionalism, and we see a move away from this notion of conformity. And in so many ways, those moves in these different directions are also matched by an equally uneasy feeling around 20th century art. It's something that's shared by even many of the students that I teach. So what is it that makes us so uneasy? Unlike art of the past, which is really about sometimes a kind of easy reading, perhaps a notion of pleasure, or the notion of some kind of comfort, or passive, I already said pleasure, sort of passive viewing, there's something that 20th century art demands more of us and more of its audiences. It's true that 20th century art, and by extension the art of the contemporary present, is an art that really demands something more. It is an art that tends to create discomfort. It's an art that actually tries deliberately to provoke and oftentimes leaves us with many more questions than answers. And this is something that's definitely true. So one of the turning points then that I've chosen to present to you today is one of the turning points that, number one, I love to teach. And it's also one of the turning points that I think is vastly misunderstood. And really, the turning point here, and what I'm going to tell you today, is what I tell my students before I begin teaching this section, which is that if you can open up your mind to the possibility of this moment, if you can let go of judgment and really wrap your brain around the importance of this moment, then you too can open up the potential not only to understand art, I always talk about the secret decoder ring of art, but you can also potentially emancipate yourself to another renewed understanding of genius. And it starts with this object. Oh, I missed the fear. There was the fear. Here's the object. Now, before you think that I somehow messed up my PowerPoint presentation, or that this is some sort of elitist inside art joke, or that I've simply lost my mind, I will concede that you are looking at a urinal. And it's true, and you may be surprised to know, that in 2004, 500 of the world's art professionals chose this object as the most important object of art produced in the 20th century. And this is Marcel Duchamp's fountain from 1917. Cue for surprise? No? Okay. And this object, when it was produced, caused, of course, a lot of controversy and a lot of questioning around, of course, not only what art could be or what it is, but in creating this sort of moment, we know that Duchamp himself really became the center point of discussion. And why that was is something that we have to think about now in terms of the historical record. So if we go back in time, we have to cast our minds back to the moment when Duchamp, as a young man, decides to leave Paris and go to New York. And when he made this decision, he was making it at a time that, of course, was all about the horrors and the violence of the First World War. He was living at a time when it was really difficult, in fact, to make a living as an artist because people were questioning the role of the artist. And it was also at a time when he was less interested in the craft or the object of making art, and he himself was a very talented painter. And he was increasingly interested and captivated by the conversations and the discussions that people were having in Paris about the future of art, what art would mean after the war ended. And so he decides to move to New York. And he moves away from Paris, which is a place, of course, associated with tradition. And he decides to take up a new kind of project. He arrives in New York, and one of the first things that he does is he has to get a job, as we all do, and he begins to teach French to English-speaking students. And coming home from work one day, he's walking along Fifth Avenue, and he walks inside a store, and he purchases a standard model Bedfordshire urinal, in case you were wondering what that was. He takes it back to his studio, he turns it 90 degrees from the angle that it normally is presented, and he scrawls his pseudonym R.Mutt on it with the date 1917. He then decides to submit this object to an unjuried art show, and all an unjuried art show is an art show where everything that's submitted is promised to be exhibited, the best kind of art show for artists. And some days, and maybe a week later, he gets word back that this object has been rejected. Surprise. And why? Well, because it's not art, right? And so at this moment, he could have taken this rejection, like many artists and regular everyday people do, to heart and stop there. But we know that Duchamp perhaps expected and wanted this to happen, and it activated the second part of his plan. What he did next is he decided to take the urinal to a studio for photography. He had it photographed. And then he wrote a very concise and short defense of the piece as a work of art. And in part, this is what it read. And importantly, he published this in an art journal. It read, "Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it." You see how he capitalized chose it? He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, and he created a new thought for that object. And as a punchline to this, he actually wrote, and by the way, the only art that New York and Americans have ever produced are its bridges and its tunnels, so you don't know what art is to begin with. Just as a PS, he added that as well. So what right? What's the turning point? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you, this is a wholesale paradigm shift in how we think about artistry and genius. And I've broken down the lessons here into 5 key characteristics that we can learn from in this understanding of a new, reconceived everyday genius. And it begins with our first characteristic, ask the question, what if? Duchamp asked the question, what if? What if everything you thought about art simply wasn't the case? Does art have to be beautiful? Does the intention of the artist determine the meaning of the object of art? Or is there something else going on here? One of the game-changing moments that Duchamp introduces is the notion that art is not about its objecthood, that art is not just an object. And in fact, it's about much more than that, right? And in that acknowledgement, what he really did was opened up the potential for really questioning all of the assumptions about art in new and different ways. He said instead that art is an idea that is subject to constant shifting changes dependent upon factors outside the control of any individual artist, especially a genius artist. And so by opening this up, he really in many ways opened up the potential for all of these new ways of thinking and conceiving about art. And I think you would admit that 100 years after Duchamp, we see a widened possibility for not only what art can be, but also for who an artist can be as well. And it starts 100 years ago with Duchamp asking the question, what if? This leads then to our second characteristic of everyday genius that I'd like to share with you, which is this idea of trying on different points of view. Now, what's interesting for Duchamp is that that idea of the urinal did not emerge out of some vacuum, right? I mean, he was a man operating at a particular place and time. Casting ourselves back to 100 years ago in the early 20th century, he was a part of a new media revolution, not unlike, by the way, the new media revolution that we're experiencing today. And one of the things that he and other artists noticed was the shifting perspective that was made possible through new technologies such as the machine eye of the camera, early photography and early film. And so one of the paintings that he made during this period in 1912 is called Nude Descending a Staircase. This particular painting was interesting because he was trying to work out the static representation of movement on a two-dimensional plane in a way that really evoked the idea of movement through saw in the camera. Working with other Cubist artists in the early 20th century, he was really looking at early photo experiments and early cinema to arrive at these ideas. And I'm showing you here a photo experiment by Edward Muybridge of a nude descending a staircase. And you can see simultaneous different kinds of view that are presented here. For Duchamp, he believed that this would provoke new ideas and new ways of seeing not only, of course, art, but also the world around art. And he wanted to continue this provocation through entering into the world, really, of the object that he chose for his next big New York idea. And so what can we learn from this? Well, for us, it's the same sort of lesson, the notion of new media. How can we continue to look at the new media around us today, and how can we see that it's still pushing us to see from perspectives that we've never thought of before, and allowing then for those multiple perspectives to multiply and provoke new ways of seeing the world. The lesson here is almost identical in our own time. So this leads directly then to the next characteristic, and this is breaking the frame, literally and figuratively. One of the radical moves that Duchamp makes with the urinal is one that I think is really interesting for us to ponder. The idea that the hand of the artist is not necessary to produce a work of art. And in fact, it was enough for Duchamp to just change our idea about an object and let it exist as two ideas at the same time. This was enough for him to really say that we have something new here for a perspective on art. On the one hand, the object could still exist as the urinal, that base, everyday, banal object we associate with the routines of life. And on the other hand, we could then, under the right set of circumstances, with the right atmosphere, environment, and support in history and institutions, elevate that idea to the level of intellectual interpretation. And so this required some serious out-of-the-box thinking for Duchamp. I mean, he's literally reframing our idea of what art is. And instead of doing it through painting, he did it through the ready-made object, an object not made by the hand of an artist. And he also deliberately chose the ugliest thing he could find, a urinal, to make the point that that too could really ask us the question of whether or not beauty is necessary when creating an object of art. So this then helps us understand perhaps the next characteristic a little bit better, that is the challenging of the status quo. For Duchamp, the challenge really was to art institutions, and it was this, to de-deify the artist. What does that mean? Well, it means to dismantle the notion of the artist's genius at its core, to dismantle those ideas that I presented at the outset of the talk. The idea here was that Duchamp really questioned the idea that God-given talent is what creates an artist. He also said beauty is not a prerequisite of art at all. And he also said that this idea of intention, that an artist determines the meaning of a work of art, is ridiculous because it's simply not true. What he said instead is that if we shift our focus away from the object of art, from the crafthood of art, and we move it towards intellectual interpretation, we're affecting something very important. And here's what it is. He said instead of looking at the object of art, we look at the world around the object of art, the power structures, the networks, everything that supports understanding what that art object is, how it's isolated and supported, and by extension, of course, how artists are also extended that same kind of support structure. So what he really does is he opens up the Pandora's box. He opens up really the floodgates for interpretation of art in very interesting and new and really open-ended ways. The idea here then is that given the right set of circumstances, anything can be a work of art, and given the right set of circumstances, any individual person can be called or claimed to be a genius. no more exclusions. So with these four characteristics, really what we're led to is the last one, which I really think is the most important one, the one that perhaps we can learn the most from in some respects, and that is this notion of being unrelenting, maintaining grit even in the face of opposition. Here's what you need to know about Duchamp's fountain. It took him decades to gain traction on his idea, decades. It really wasn't until the late 1950s that really Duchamp's ideas gained a kind of currency with a new generation of artists. These artists, working again at a time after another war, the Second World War, were interested in really sort of reinvigorating their cause for questioning what is the role of the artist, what is the role of art in a post-war environment. And Duchamp provided for them an essential, really, new way of sort of opening up the process of thinking about art. And what's interesting is that this new generation took the idea of art as idea, art as concept, and they joined it to the countercultural revolutions that were taking place around the world in the 1960s. What they did is they basically worked together, artists and new practitioners of the countercultural movement, to break down the false distinctions between high and low art, to open up the possibility for art to be many different kinds of things, moving away from dogma, moving away from tradition. Today, some of that outgrowth we see really in the work of street art or performance art or video art or even photography, which wasn't even considered art up until about 20 years ago, right? But more importantly, I think that we get something else from Duchamp and his legacy, and that is this notion of a remix culture. The idea of being able to take ideas from different parts of the world, whether it be through culture, whether it be through looking at the popular everyday, looking through art, looking through history, and artists and practitioners recombine these ideas to create, and here it is, new ideas for those things in combination, provoking a new generation of people to see beyond the object presented to them. And so what is the lesson for us here? Well, it's one in perseverance and grit. And what I think is interesting with Duchamp is that he maintained the resolve of his beliefs around fountain for all of those decades, and he actually was quite famous by the time that he died. He, in fact, said, "I threw a urinal in their faces and they declared it art." And this is something that he said just before he died, because he understood the irony of being embraced by the art institution that he sought so hard to really critique. And so the lesson here for us is really one in this perseverance and grit, as I say. Imagine in a world today where we have really, in many ways, a lack of patience. We don't delay our gratification. We always look for sort of the easy, fast answer. Imagine dedicating yourself to an idea bigger than yourself for a very long period of time. And imagine how much we need that in our culture today. We really need that kind of thinking, and this is something that Duchamp brought us. So in the end, then, really what I'm wanting to do now, let's go back, is to put the question back to you. That is this notion of genius. What ideas do you perhaps harbor or retain around genius that you want to expand and change? What traits of genius do you think exist, and do you believe that they're only for an exclusive few? Do you believe that you too can expand the notion of an artistic genius? It's true that this particular object, which we've talked about today, was one that really expanded this idea of genius. And there is something called genius studies. It's something that I looked into for this talk. Fascinating field of study. I wish I was in it. What I learned from it is that there's no consensus out there about what makes a genius. But what is true is three values that I distilled from my research into this area that seem important and relevant to share here. One is this idea that in genius studies, there's this notion of harnessing a creative potential, harnessing creativity. And this is the kind of creativity that comes when the mind is at rest and it's playing. This idea that comes after you've powered down your devices and you're just staring out a window. Who does that anymore? Right? This idea of letting the mind rest, right? That's one. The second is a notion of raw intelligence. And I'm not talking about that kind of intelligence that is superficial so that you know a lot about a lot of things. We're talking about targeted, very intense dedication to one area of thought for a long period of time. Those two things, when joined to the third critical factor that I've found out was one of these determining factors, is that thing we always hear, the buzzword, critical thinking, critical thinking. It's something that we're supposed to be teaching here at the university, and we do. But what is critical thinking but really having people think beyond what it is that they're told to believe about something? When married to the first two, those three produce a potent and very important base for the notion of genius. So in the end, the lesson of Duchamp is really the lesson in asking the question, what if? It's about really challenging the status quo, breaking the frames, and being persistent, maintaining that grit. And here's the thing, you guys, the world needs a lot more Duchamps, that's for sure. The question is, will you be one of them? Thank you. Thank you.